Hello, I'm Tom Rothman of 20th Century Fox. Welcome to Fox Legacy. We're glad to have you with us.
It's showtime, folks.
Creation and destruction are often linked in the academic analysis of art, from the smashing of stone that yields the David to the fractured figures of Guernica. And the tortured artist, suffering in mind and soul for the sake of his art, able to bring forth joy only from pain, is familiar in such circles to the point of cliche. Me? I never much bought it. I think great art can come from contentment as surely as from suffering. Not that art is ever easy in any sense of the word, far from it. But hard work and high standards, the requisite companions to genius, don't necessarily require self-flagellation, self-indulgence, and self-destruction. At least, that's what I thought, until I considered the creator of tonight's film. When asked by Life magazine to give a sense of himself, Bob Fosse said, quote, "You could do that in 2 words, fucked up." Am I allowed to say that on cable? Although ranked only 14th on the AFI's list of 100 most important movie musicals, I submit that All That Jazz ought to be much, much higher. Its radical subversion of the very form of the traditional film musical itself is father to all of the postmodern movie musicals, from our own Moulin Rouge to Chicago 9, etc., that followed its 1979 release. Not to mention that it is that rarest of the rare, unusual in its time and almost unheard of now, an entirely original musical film, written and conceived directly for the screen, and not based on an existing piece of theater, but instead on the hubris that its creator's own life is a monumental subject. Oh, yeah, and I should mention it's about death, his death. Death courted, death flaunted, death defied, but ultimately, death triumphant. Who would dare? Well, the first person to have won an Oscar, an Emmy, and a Tony, all for Best Director, Bob Fosse. Reams have been written about the stylistic signatures of Fosse as both a choreographer and a director. All That Jazz, of his 5 films, is the best one to view those techniques, the independent body part counterpunctual choreography begun in the Pajama Game's famous Steam Heat number and perfected by him in Chicago, which, by the way, was a movie Hollywood wouldn't let Fosse direct. The jump cut editing style that is the film equivalent and match for that style of dance, and the interspersed narrative progressions where the musical numbers, rather than advancing the story as in traditional musical structures, instead comment upon the characters of the story and do so often with biting irony. Well, all of those techniques are on display here tonight in virtuoso form, but I'll leave the analysis of them to the many academics far more expert in dance on film than me. What fascinates me most, and what I call to your attention tonight, is, perhaps with the exception of Fellini himself in 8½, the most conspicuous spectacle ever of a man stripping himself bare, and of course glorifying himself at the same time, in a movie he is making about himself. Talk about balls.
You were in Traffic Jam.
Yes, sir.
Who was the director of Traffic Jam?
You were Mr. Gideon.
Oh. How was I?
Terrific.
And who was the choreographer?
You were Mr. Gideon.
How was I?
Fantastic.
That's how you get a job.
All That Jazz didn't actually kill Bob Fosse. His untimely death, which is foreshadowed and depicted in the film, wouldn't come for 7 more years. It was his co-author, Robert Alan Arthur, who actually died during the filming. But it certainly nearly destroyed many of those involved in making the film, which is perfect symmetry after all. But in just about every other significant aspect, All That Jazz is the ultimate film about art imitating life, imitating art, imitating life, and on in a house of endless mirrors. Here's the backstory you need to know. By the mid-1970s, Bob Fosse was a king in three worlds: the theater, the movies, and his own unrepentant, extravagant, drug and sex-filled life. He was the most successful Broadway force of his era, with The Pajama Game, Damn Yankees, Sweet Charity, Pippin, already to his credit, and the Academy Award-winning director of Cabaret. An estranged husband to his third wife, Gwen Verdon, he engaged in so many simultaneous affairs with so many beautiful and extraordinary women that a scorecard couldn't keep him straight. He was cheating on Gwen Verdon with Jennifer Narn Smith, and on her with the extraordinary Anne Ranking, and eventually on her with Jessica Lange and many others. He practiced very conventional, chauvinist pig behavior, indulging his every carnal interest. But if, God forbid, one of his many ladies strayed from him, Fosse would rage. In one satisfying bit of turnabout as fair play, when Jessica Lange left him for Mikhail Baryshnikov, Fosse was said to have been more shaken by the fact that he lost out to a better dancer than a better man. It was perhaps Gwen Verdon, who separated from him but never did divorce him, and who was walking next to him the moment he died, who had the best perspective on his compulsive womanizing. She said, quote, "I think the real reason I was never jealous of the other women was that I knew his real affair was with death." And so, juggling many affairs, strung out on drugs and cigarettes, Fosse was rehearsing Chicago and editing Lenny all at once. And he promptly had a massive heart attack. He required bypass surgery and followed it with a second heart attack. I know, he thought, let's make a musical about that. And so he did. In his first draft of All That Jazz, Fosse based so much on his own life experience that he used everybody's real names. But ultimately, Bob Fosse became Joe Gideon, editing a movie called The Stand-Up, which was really Lenny, and directing a musical starring his former wife, which was really a musical Chicago, starring his estranged wife, Gwen Verdon, while also carrying on an affair with a young dancer, which was Anne Ranking, both on and off screen. You got all that? By the way, at one point in my young career, I had the privilege to do some little work for Anne Ranking, and I can tell you that in addition to her astounding beauty, her physical grace, and breathtaking dancing skills, she is a hugely intelligent woman, smart in all the ways that Fosse, riddled with self-doubt and self-destructive impulse as he was, could not match.
Oh, God damn it. How dare you use my phone, my telephone, to call somebody who's not gay?
I see. You can go out with any girl in town.
That's right. I go out with any girl in town. I stay in with you.
There are many exact moments in this thinly veiled autobiography that were borrowed from Fosse's own life. Young Joe Gideon's musical act is billed as tops in taps, just as his own was years earlier. Getting aroused by a stripper just before going on stage was a boyhood memory that humiliated Fosse and perhaps shaped the way he felt about women. And on the brighter side, the Everything Old is New Again number with Anne Ranking and Erzsébet Fold is modeled after dances that Ranking used to create with Fosse's daughter, Nicole, to perform in front of her dad. It's surprising, almost jarring, really, to see such a sweet, wholesome moment in this film, but it goes a long way towards showing the other side of this monster that Fosse had created. Fosse also included that scene because he knew that the suits back in Hollywood were scared to death that he was doing a, quote, death and dance musical, and thought that adding a light number would keep him going for a few more weeks, and he was right. By the way, Fosse's daughter, Nicole, also makes a cameo in the film, seen as a dancer stretching her legs. Realism also extended to the shots of the open-heart surgery. That's the real deal. 4 patients agreed to have their surgeries filmed for the movie. I guess everybody wants to be in show business. But it's possible that those shots were only safeties, just in case Fosse couldn't get the real thing. You see, during the filming, Fosse was eerily having the same heart pains that Joe Gideon did. So, striving to put as much reality up on the screen as possible, he cast the film with as many real-life people as he could. The actor playing the editor of the stand-up is really Oscar-winning editor Alan Heim, who edited both Lenny and All That Jazz. The lighting designer and stage manager of the film are also played by Fosse's real-life lighting designer and stage manager. Ironically, Fosse put Anne Rankin through repeated, grueling auditions, never committing, to the point where producer Daniel Melnick intervened. "I've got to be sure," Fosse said. "Sure of what?" Melnick replied. "That she can play herself?" Perhaps, responding to Jessica Lange being out of reach for him personally, he used Lange professionally as Angelique, the angel of death, the ultimate temptation, who was also out of reach until giving in to death. And as to why, since Bob Fosse being in absolute control over both the real and the fictional versions of Bob Fosse could have rendered a more sympathetic portrait of himself, why he instead chose to show himself in full-on bastard genius mode, well, I guess there are two ways to look at that. We might be impressed that he was showing the unvarnished truth about himself, or we might recognize the more cynical contrival at work even here. Herb Gardner, the massively insightful playwright, said in one of the interviews Fosse and co-writer Arthur conducted with people close to him to use as, quote, source material, Gardner said, quote, "You list your crimes at the slightest provocation. I think you do it to absolve yourself," he said to Fosse. "You go on record with your sins. It's your final play, the biggest con of all. The truth hurts." My own sense is that it's some of both. Say a few Hail Marys and move on. And also, if you're going to present yourself as a genius, you better admit a few flaws. I'm certainly very convinced that Fosse would have cared far more that his talent be enshrined than his character. And indeed, you've got to love the madmen, the few geniuses of audacity and ego who will either go down burning in flames, often taking their studio backers with them, think Orson Welles, who never did finish many projects, including his version of Don Quixote, or Michael Cimino's Heaven's Gate, which bankrupted United Artists just 2 years after winning the Academy Award with Deer Hunter. But, on the other hand, on rare occasions, like tonight's film, they triumph against impossible odds. That is, if they and we live to tell the tale. And here, Columbia Pictures had its own near-death experience, such that in the end, it took not one, but 2 studios to survive this dance and death movie. I'll be back after the film to tell you a bit of that story and give you some perspective of what it's like from the other end of the rope, tied off to a great white whale of the Great White Way and to be hanging on for dear life. But from the safety and quiet of retrospect, where the womb of time heals all the hurts and leaves only the brilliance and transcendence of art to endure, from there, it's best just to let the magic work its wonders on you. But do keep in mind as you watch that the pains in Joe Gideon's heart would fell him just a scant 7 years after completing this film, and with only one more badly failed film, Star 80, to his credit. Bob Fosse dropped dead walking home with Gwen Verdon from the opening night of the D.C. revival of Sweet Charity, even while Cabaret, his other show, was playing across town. The lights on Broadway dimmed in memory. History recounts no last words, but of course, it didn't need to. Fosse had already done that himself. You see, Vincent Canby, the New York Times critic I grew up on and greatly admired, had it right when he said of the film you were about to see, it's, quote, an uproarious display of brilliance, nerve, dance, maudlin confessions, inside jokes, and especially ego. It's a little bit, he said, as if Mr. Fosse had invited us to attend a funeral, the wildest show business send-off a fellow ever designed for himself, and then appeared at the door to sell tickets and count the house. After all, funerals are only wasted on the dead. Well, not this funeral, and not this man. Would that any of us could go out with even a fraction of his style. For Bob Fosse, it was always showtime, folks. Enjoy. Mr. Bob Fosse was no more conscientious as a filmmaker than he was as a person, and that, I'm sorry to say, was not a high bar. Talented? Yes. Daring? Abundantly so. Brilliant? Beyond question. Responsible, trustworthy, solicitous of his partners, collaborators, or financiers? No. Indeed, Fosse's own good friend, Robert Allen Author, was the co-author of All That Jazz. Fosse made him the producer of the film and then promptly turned on him viciously. Author died 5 weeks into the film. And things were no better for the movie's original backer, Columbia Pictures. In a classic sign of a runaway production to come, All That Jazz was already over budget before it started. I've been there, folks, and trust me, that ain't good. After a long, difficult search for its star, Richard Dreyfuss, who had finally won the role, dropped out shortly before filming was to start because of the difficulty of working with Fosse. Before they settled on the other Jaws star, Roy Scheider, Fosse spent weeks insisting that he should play the role himself. Daniel Melnick, who began as the film's executive producer and midway became head of its first financier, Columbia Pictures, finally prevented that, only on the grounds that Bob, a double heart attack victim, was likely to die during shooting if he did both jobs. Of course, the truth was, Fosse was way too old for the part and way too uncommercial casting. But his ego knew no bounds. During the filming, the production fell further and further behind, and the dailies got darker and darker. At one point, Fosse actually stopped filming for a week to rehearse a dance number, something that's terribly costly if not planned in advance. In my own experience, movies are very, very rarely shut down once they get going. It does happen with total disaster sometimes, and maybe should happen more often. This studio, for one, would have saved itself from near bankruptcy if it had shut down Cleopatra at almost any point and just written off the loss. But as rare as such a shutdown is, it's even rarer for that to come with just 8 days of scheduled shooting left. Of course, scheduled shooting, particularly on a runaway show, doesn't mean actual shooting. By that point, All That Jazz was fully $4 million over its original $6 million budget and climbing fast. With the Death musical finale still to be shot, Columbia finally put its foot down and pulled the plug. They would not pay for Fosse to finish. They wanted Alan Hyme and Fosse to cut the film together and then see how to finance what was actually still needed to finish it. Hal Melnick, now head of Columbia and executive producer both, conveyed this news to his director, I can't really imagine, but it's lucky for Fox that he did, as that's the point where this studio comes to join this particular peculiar bit of movie immortality. See, in the current movie business, with the dramatic escalation of costs and the investment in any one film and its advertising often exceeding $200 or $300 million, it's not that unusual for studios to join together at the outset to co-finance and co-distribute a film. We did this most famously with our production of Titanic, for worse and better, which is a fun story I'll tell you sometime. But back in the All That Jazz days, it was almost unheard of. And after the film had been largely shot, well, I'll tell you, this is the only instance that I've ever heard of that, period. Here's what happened. Melnick and one of his vice presidents, the brilliant Sherry Lansing, who would soon go on to run Fox herself during a long and very illustrious career, took 7 reels of the film to then Fox president Alan Ladd Jr.'s house. Ladd was having a party that Melnick had just crashed, but still, drawn by the creative promise of Bob Fosse, Ladd politely extracted himself from his guests to watch the incomplete film. He must have liked what he saw, because he agreed to co-finance the picture, and exchange took top billing and domestic distribution. That's why in the opening credits, Fox always comes first. That is one of 2 particularly bold decisions that Alan Ladd Jr., son of Hollywood royalty and known throughout the land as Laddie, made during his tenure as head of Fox that have paid long dividends for the studio. The other was saying yes to an off-the-wall space movie by a young second-time director out of USC named George Lucas. Star Wars shaped the entire ensuing course of the movie industry, in addition to being tremendously lucrative for the studio. All That Jazz, while not a great financial success, it actually did okay at the box office. I went back and checked the books. After about 2 years, Fox had made about $1.5 million on its investment. But as of today, we've now made about $12 million. Well, not a very great amount for a big company over 25 years, but a very good illustration of one of the ways studios survive. If you make a good film, or in the case of All That Jazz, a great film, even if it doesn't make a big profit to start, as long as you don't lose big, over time that film will accrete value to the company. It adds to the library and the value of the library. Thus, Laddie's brave move of stepping into the troubled breach over time strengthened Fox's library and gave us the enduring aesthetic value of having one of the seminal movies of the 1970s bear the Fox fanfare. There are only 6 major studios, and that's all there can ever be, because a studio is made up of both its current product and its history. Without history, without a library of collective effort born of decades of labor and investment, everybody else is just Johnny-come-lately. So Columbia's misfortune with a movie fast heading towards being 100% over budget became Fox's opportunity. There's a term of art we use in our business for this kind of box office performance. We like to say, quote, "We got out." It means we broke even in the short term and we live to fight again. And the film will live to see what verdict, if any, history has for it, or if history cares at all. For All That Jazz, that was 9 Academy Award nominations, 4 wins, and the Palme d'Or at Cannes in 1980, and a movie that no student of the musical genre or modern film aesthetic in general can afford to miss.
Right to the end.
It's getting close, Joe.
Just like a friend.
Where were you, Joe? Where were
We
you?
tried to warn you. Somehow.
You didn't listen, Daddy. You didn't listen.
You had your way. Now you must pay. We're glad that you're sorry now.
Cut! For Fox Legacy, I'm Tom Rothman. We'll see you next time.